Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are sounds you never forget. The crack of a lasgun discharging in the dark. The low rumble of a Lehman Russ engine turning over in the motor pool at dawn. The soft hiss of your rebreather kicking in as the air thins on some nameless rock at the edge of known space. These sounds become a part of you when you serve in the Astra Militarum. They seep into your bones and settle in behind your eyes, and after enough campaigns, they begin to feel like home. But there is one sound, one particular sound, that no amount of training or prayer or chemical conditioning can prepare a soldier for. It is the sound of a greenskin horde bearing down upon your position at full speed. Not one orc, not a raiding party, not a skirmishing mob, a true green tide. Thousands of throats bellowing their savage war cry in unison, in a sound so deep and primal that it shakes the ground beneath your boots and rattles the teeth inside your skull. That rolling thunder of alien fury, building and building, a tidal wave of noise that drowns out orders, drowns out thought, drowns out everything except the cold animal certainty that something terrible is about to happen. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a guardsman, not a hero of the Imperium, not a decorated commissar or a celebrated tank commander, just one of the billions of ordinary men and women who carry a lasgun and a prayer to the God Emperor and hope that both are enough to see them through another day. You are standing in a trench on some frontier world whose name you have already forgotten because the Departamento Munitorum sent you here with orders that simply read, "Hold this line," and nothing else. The sun is going down. The air smells like mud and promethium and something else, something meaty and fungal that you cannot quite place. And then you hear it, that sound, that terrible, rolling, building sound that seems to come from everywhere at once, like the planet itself has opened its mouth to scream. They come out of the dust like a hallucination. Green shapes, massive and loping, moving with a speed that seems impossible for creatures of their bulk. They are firing as they come, their crude weapons spitting shells and rockets and gouts of flame in every direction, as much at each other as at your defensive line. The noise is beyond description. It is not the disciplined crack of Imperial volley fire or the precise hum of Aeldari weaponry. It is chaos given form. A wall of sound made from roaring engines, barking guns, bellowing voices, and the constant metallic clatter of a million pieces of scrap metal all moving at once. Your sergeant is screaming orders, but you cannot hear him over the din. The man next to you is firing his lasgun on full automatic, the beam lancing out into the green mass, and you can see it burning through alien flesh, but it does not matter. For every orc that stumbles, 3 more stomp over the body, without a second glance. They do not care. They are not afraid. They are having the time of their lives. And then the line breaks. Maybe it is your section. Maybe it is the unit to your left. Maybe it is everywhere all at once. It does not matter where it starts, because once the greenskins get in among you, once those massive green fists and rusty blades start swinging at close range, the battle is over. You are no longer a soldier defending a position. You are prey. This is where your story truly begins. Not on the battlefield, not in the moment of heroic last stand that the imperial propagandists will never write about because there is no one left to tell it. Your story begins in the moment after. The moment when the dust settles and the screaming fades and you realize, with a cold horror that settles into the pit of your stomach like a swallowed stone, that you are still alive, and you very much wish you were not. Welcome back to Q on 40,000. Tonight, we are going to talk about one of the most harrowing experiences that any soul in the grim darkness of the far future can endure. We are going to talk about what it is like to be a prisoner of the Orks. Now, before we go any further, let me say something important. When most people think about the Orks, they think about the funny ones. The ones who paint their vehicles red because they believe it makes them go faster. The ones who build guns so big and ridiculous that they explode half the time. The ones who communicate almost entirely in bellowed insults and headbutts. And all of that is true. The Orks are, in many ways, the most entertaining faction in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. They are absurd and colourful, and their approach to warfare is so gleefully unhinged that it is hard not to find them charming in a terrifying sort of way. But here is what the codexes and the tabletop games sometimes gloss over. Here is what the novels and the deeper lore make painfully clear. The Orks are not just comic relief. They are one of the most genuinely horrifying threats in a galaxy that is already stuffed to bursting with horrors. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the way they treat the beings they capture. Because the Orks do take prisoners. Not always, not consistently, and not for the reasons you might expect. But they do it. And what happens to those prisoners is something that would make even the Dark Eldar of Komorragh raise an eyebrow. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us walk together through the nightmare that awaits any poor soul unlucky enough to be taken alive by the green tide. The first thing you need to understand is why the Orks bother taking prisoners at all, because on the surface, it does not make much sense. The Orks are a species that exists almost entirely for the purpose of fighting. Well, they were engineered that way tens of millions of years ago by the ancient beings known as the Old Ones during the great conflict called the War in Heaven. The Orks, or the Krork as they were originally known, were living weapons, biological war machines designed to fight the terrible enemies of their creators, the Necrontyr and the star gods known as the Satan. That programming, that deep genetic imperative to fight and kill and conquer, has never faded. Every Ork in the galaxy carries it in every cell of their body. They do not fight because they are angry or afraid. They do not fight because they have been ordered to or because they believe in some grand cause. They fight because it is what they are. Fighting is to an Ork what breathing is to a human. It is the fundamental act of their existence, yet the thing they are most perfectly designed to do. So why would a creature like that bother to keep anything alive? Why not simply kill everything in sight and move on to the next fight? The answer, as with most things in Ork society, is surprisingly practical. The Orks need workers. You see, for all their genetic engineering and their incredible physical resilience, the Orks have a problem. They are, to put it bluntly, lazy. Not in the way that a human might be lazy, lounging about and avoiding work. An Ork will happily spend hours fighting, building weapons, racing vehicles, or engaging in any activity that involves noise, violence, or competition. But the dull, repetitive, back-breaking labor that is necessary to keep a war machine running, the hauling of raw materials, the processing of scrap metal, the manufacture of ammunition, is the construction of fortifications. This kind of work is beneath them. It is boring. It is tedious. It is, in their own parlance, not properly Orky. This is where the smaller greenskins come in. The Gretchen, those scrawny, sharp-nosed, pointy-eared creatures that scurry around the feet of their larger Ork masters, exist in part to perform this labor. They cook the food, carry the ammunition, clean the weapons, and generally keep the whole ramshackle machinery of Ork civilization lurching forward. Below them are the Snotlings, tiny and dim-witted creatures, barely capable of following simple instructions, who tend the fungus farms and perform the most basic tasks. But sometimes, especially when an Ork civilization grows large enough and ambitious enough, even the Gretchen and Snotlings are not sufficient. The factories need workers. The mines need diggers. The shipyards need hands to haul the constant influx of raw materials. And when the supply of greenskin labor runs short, the Orks turn their attention to whatever other species happen to be nearby. In most cases, that means humans. The moment of capture itself is, by all accounts, utterly disorienting. The battlefield is chaos. Smoke and dust and the acrid stink of alien weapons fire hang in the air like fog. Bodies lie everywhere, human and greenskin alike, piled in the grotesque configurations that only intense violence can produce. You are dazed, possibly wounded, certainly terrified. Your unit has been scattered or destroyed. Your weapons are gone, knocked from your hands, or crushed beneath the trampling feet of the horde. And then a shadow falls over you, an orc, close up. That is nothing like the crude illustrations in the uplifting primer that every guardsman receives upon their induction. Those illustrations show the greenskins as hunched, ugly, but ultimately manageable creatures, roughly human-sized and easily dispatched with a well-aimed lasgun shot. The reality is staggeringly different. An average orc boy stands well over 2 meters tall and weighs several hundred kilograms of dense green-skinned muscle and bone. Their arms are long enough to drag on the ground when they want them to, and their hands are the size of dinner plates, each finger tipped with a thick, dirty claw. Their faces are broad and flat, and dominated by a jaw that juts forward like the prow of a warship, filled with tusks the size of your thumb. And they smell. Emperor's throne, they smell. A deep, fungal, organic stench that is somehow both alien and immediately recognizable as the scent of something very large and very alive. It clings to everything in orc territory, soaking into walls and floors and the very air itself until it becomes a physical presence, thick and oily and impossible to escape. The orc that finds you does not kill you. This is the first surprise, and for many captured soldiers, it is the worst one. Because in that moment, as the massive green hand closes around your arm or your collar or the back of your flak armor and hauls you up like a sack of grain, you realize something terrible. You realize that whatever is coming next, death would have been simpler. Death would have been clean. Death would have been over. But the orc has other plans. Sometimes the capture is deliberate. An orc knob, one of the larger and more cunning members of the species, will bellow orders to his boys to grab some of the smaller creatures instead of stomping them flat. This usually happens when the warband is in need of labor for some project or another, or when the orc in question has been instructed by a mech boy or a war boss to bring back workers for a particular task. Sometimes the capture is opportunistic. An orc finds a living human among the dead and decides, on a whim, to drag them along rather than bashing their head in. Maybe the human did something interesting during the fight, showed some spark of defiance that caught the orc's attention. Maybe the orc is just in a good mood, flushed with the joy of victory, and wants a trophy to show off back at camp. Or maybe it is simply that killing one more helpless creature just is not as fun as keeping it around to see what happens next. Whatever the reason, you are scooped up and carried off, sometimes literally carried, tucked under an orc's arm or slung over their shoulder like luggage, sometimes dragged by the ankle or the wrist, your body bumping and scraping over the churned-up battlefield while the orc that holds you laughs and shouts at its companions, sometimes herded in a group with other survivors, pushed and prodded by Gretchen, armed with sharp sticks and crude electric prods, forced to march at a pace your exhausted body can barely maintain. The journey from the battlefield to whatever passes for an orc camp or settlement is a nightmare in itself. The orcs do not slow down for their prisoners, and they do not offer water or food or medical attention. If you stumble and fall, you are kicked until you get back up or dragged along the dirt until you do. If your wounds are severe enough that you cannot keep moving, you are left behind, or worse, handed off to the Gretchen to deal with. The Gretchen, denied the opportunity to participate in real fighting by their larger cousins, tend to take out their frustrations on helpless prisoners with a cruelty that belies their small size. They poke and prod and bite and spit, and generally make themselves as unpleasant as possible, delighted to finally have something they can bully without fear of being smashed flat in return. And then you arrive. You see the camp for the first time, and whatever remained of your hope dies quietly inside your chest. But the first sight of an orc camp is something that survivors struggle to describe with any coherence. It is not so much a settlement as it is an explosion of activity frozen in mid-detonation. Everything is noise and movement, and the constant clang of metal on metal. Crude structures made from scrap iron and salvaged wreckage rise in haphazard formations, leaning against each other at angles that seem to defy structural engineering. Smoke pours from 100 makeshift chimneys and exhaust pipes. Gretchen scurry in every direction, carrying tools and materials and what appear to be various body parts, both mechanical and organic. Somewhere in the distance, engines roar and weapons fire, because in an orc camp, there is always something being tested or fought over or simply blown up for entertainment. And everywhere, there are the orcs themselves, lounging in the shade of their crude structures, fighting with each other over scraps of food or shiny objects, tinkering with weapons that look like they were assembled from the contents of a junkyard, which they almost certainly were. The sound of their voices, deep and guttural and punctuated by barking laughter, fills the air like the rumble of distant thunder. The camp does not sleep. The orcs do not keep regular hours. Activity is constant, driven by whatever impulse strikes whatever orc happens to be awake at the moment. This is where you are brought. This is where the next chapter of your life, whatever remains of it, begins. And to understand what happens next, you need to understand something about how orc society is structured. Because while it may look like pure anarchy from the outside, there is actually a fairly rigid hierarchy at work. It is just that this hierarchy is based entirely on two things: size and the willingness to use violence. At the very top of any orc community sits the war boss. This is the biggest, meanest, most dangerous orc in the tribe, and his authority is absolute for exactly as long as he remains the biggest, meanest, and most dangerous. The moment a challenger emerges who can beat the war boss in a fight, that challenger becomes the new war boss, and the old one either dies or is reduced to a subordinate role. It is a system that is, in its way, ruthlessly efficient. Leadership always belongs to the strongest, which means that orc leaders are, almost by definition, the most capable warriors their species can produce. Below the war boss are the nobs, the aristocracy of orc society. These are orcs who have grown large and powerful through years of fighting and winning, their bodies physically expanding in response to their success. A successful nob can stand a head taller than an ordinary boy and possess the strength to tear a human in half without visible effort. The nobs serve as squad leaders, enforcers, and champions, and they answer only to the war boss, or to whoever is big enough to make them listen. Below the nobs are the boys, the rank and file of the orc species. This is the vast majority of the greenskin population, the countless millions of green-skinned warriors who make up the bulk of every warband and every great crusade. A single orc boy is a formidable opponent for any human soldier. A mob of them, worked into a frenzy by the prospect of battle. It is a force of nature that can overwhelm fortified positions and shatter professional armies through sheer weight of numbers and aggression. And then there are the odd boys. These are the specialists of orc society, the ones born with innate abilities and instincts that set them apart from the common boys. The mech boys, who can build and repair technology without ever having been taught how. The pain boys, who possess an intuitive understanding of anatomy and surgery, terrifying as their application of that knowledge might be. The weird boys, who channel the raw psychic energy generated by the orc collective consciousness into devastating attacks. And the runthards, who we will talk about in much more detail shortly, because the runthards are the orcs who are most directly responsible for what happens to prisoners. Now, beneath all of these, at the absolute bottom of the orc social order are the lesser greenskins. The Gretchen come first, those wiry, cunning little creatures who perform the menial tasks that orcs consider beneath them. Despite their small size and relative weakness, Gretchen have developed an entire subculture of their own within orc society, running black markets, placing bets on fights, brewing fungus beer, and generally hustling their way through a world that could crush them at any moment. They bear no particular resentment toward the orcs who abuse them, because as far as they are concerned, this is simply the way things are. The orcs are bigger, so the orcs are in charge. That is the fundamental law of greenskin existence. Below the Gretchen are the snotlings, tiny, simple-minded creatures barely larger than a human child. Those who tend the fungus farms and perform tasks so basic that even the Gretchen will not bother with them. And then, below everything, below the snotlings, below the fungus, below the squigs that eat the refuse, there is you, the human slave, the lowest form of life in the entire orc ecosystem. A creature so insignificant that most orcs do not even register your existence as worthy of attention unless they happen to need something carried or want something to kick. This is your position in the hierarchy. This is where you stand. And the orc that is responsible for keeping you in that position, for making sure you work and do not escape and do not die before you have served your purpose, is the Runthard. Runthards, sometimes called slavers, are a particular breed of orc oddboy. When they are born with a quality that is almost unheard of among their kind, a quality that other orcs find deeply suspicious and slightly disturbing. Patience. Where an ordinary orc communicates primarily through shouting, hitting, and the occasional headbutt, a Runthard has the ability to actually manage lesser beings with something approaching method. They can train Gretchen to perform specific tasks. They can condition snotlings to follow basic commands. And, when circumstances require it, they can break human prisoners into obedient workers with a methodical efficiency that would be impressive if it were not so terrifying. The tools of the Runthird's trade are simple and brutal. The whip, used to punish slow workers and maintain discipline through the oldest language in the galaxy, pain. The grabber stick, as a long pole with a mechanical claw at one end, used to snatch up fleeing prisoners and hurl them back into their work area with the casual ease of a shepherd returning a stray lamb to the flock. And the grot prod, an electrified rod that delivers a painful shock to any creature it touches, strong enough to drop a fully grown human to the ground in convulsions, strong enough to make you remember the lesson for the rest of your life, however long or short that life might turn out to be. Some Runthards are more sophisticated in their methods than others. The lore describes a conditioning approach used by a Runthard called Burgus, who employed what might loosely be described as positive reinforcement, alongside the usual punishment. He explained to those under his charge what was expected of them, rewarded those who performed well, and only punished those who failed. Under his management, slaves worked more effectively and died at a lower rate than under traditional orc handling methods. This is not kindness. Make no mistake about that. This is efficiency. This is an orc who has figured out that a slave who is afraid but not broken produces more work than one who has been beaten past the point of functionality. The slave is still a slave. The conditions are still nightmarish, but the calculation has shifted slightly, from pure dominance to something that an Imperial administrator might uncomfortably recognize as resource management. When a new batch of prisoners arrives at an orc settlement, it is the Runthard who takes charge. And the first thing the Runthard does, before assigning work, as before distributing the meager rations that will keep you alive just barely long enough to be useful, before anything else, is the branding. The branding is something that survivors carry with them for the rest of their lives, in their flesh and in their minds. It is a crude glyph, a symbol unique to the orc clan or tribe that has claimed ownership of the slaves. The glyph is burned into the prisoner's skin using a heated piece of scrap metal pressed against the chest, shoulder, back, or neck until the flesh chars and the symbol is permanently seared into the body. There is no anesthetic. There is no preparation. The Runthard simply grabs the prisoner, holds them still with the help of several Gretchen assistants who seem to take particular pleasure in the task, and applies the brand. The pain is extraordinary, but the psychological impact is worse, because the brand is not just a mark of ownership, it is a statement. It says, in the only language the orcs truly understand, that you are property, you are a thing, an object, a tool to be used and discarded when broken. Your name, your rank, your regiment, your homeworld, your family, your faith in the Golden Throne, none of it matters anymore. You are no longer guardsman such and such of the whateverth regiment. You are a slave, and the glyph on your flesh is the only identity you have left. For some prisoners, this is the breaking point. The moment when whatever remained of their will to resist simply collapses under the weight of what has happened to them. These people go quiet and still, their eyes emptying of everything except a dull, blank endurance that is not quite life but not yet death. But they will do what they are told, They will work until they drop. They will not fight back because there is nothing left inside them to fight with. The Rundhards know this look well, and they consider these broken prisoners the most valuable of all, because they are the easiest to manage and the least likely to cause trouble. But others fight on, at least internally. They hold on to something, some scrap of identity or purpose, that the brand cannot burn away. Maybe it is hatred of their captors. Maybe it is faith in the Emperor. Maybe it is simply the stubborn refusal to let the greenskins take everything from them, to keep one small flame burning in the darkness, even if no one else can see it. These prisoners are more dangerous, more likely to cause trouble, more likely to attempt escape or attack their overseers. But they also tend to survive longer, because the will to live is, in the end, the only thing that separates a prisoner who lasts a year from one who lasts a week. The first days of captivity are the most disorienting. Everything about Orc civilization operates on a level of sensory overload that is almost impossible for a human to process. The noise is constant and overwhelming, a never-ending cacophony of bellowing Orc voices, clanging machinery, revving engines, random weapons fire, and the high-pitched squealing of Gretchen. The smell is suffocating, that deep fungal reek mixed with engine oil, burning metal, unwashed alien bodies, and the organic stench of the squig pens. The visual landscape is a junkyard nightmare. Everything made from salvaged scrap and covered in crude paint and rough-welded patches, and the kind of engineering that seems designed to fail spectacularly at the worst possible moment. There is no quiet in an Orc camp. There is no stillness. There is no moment of peace where a prisoner can collect their thoughts and try to make sense of what has happened to them. The Orcs are active at all hours, and their activity generates a constant background roar that infiltrates every corner of the settlement. Even in the slave pens, which are usually little more than fenced-off areas or crude shelters built from whatever materials were left over after the mech boys took what they wanted, the noise and chaos of the surrounding camp bleeds through every gap and crack and seam. Sleep, when it comes at all, is fitful and broken. Not because the Orcs specifically deny it to their slaves, but because the environment makes true rest nearly impossible. You learn to doze in snatches, catching brief moments of unconsciousness between the crashes and bangs and bellows that punctuate the Orc day, which does not follow any recognizable schedule. You eat when food is provided, usually some form of fungal mash or badly cooked squig meat tossed into the pen, like slop for livestock. You drink whatever liquid is available, which is often a thin, murky broth that tastes like dishwater strained through a dirty sock. And you work. Emperor's mercy, you work. The nature of the work depends on what the Orcs need at any given moment, and what the Orcs need tends to change rapidly and without warning. One day you might be hauling scrap metal from a battlefield salvage site to a mech boy's workshop, dragging sheets of torn armor plating and twisted vehicle components across rough ground while Gretchen crack whips at your heels. The next day you might be digging, carving out trenches or foundations or mine shafts with tools that are barely functional, your hands blistering and bleeding around the handles of crude shovels that were clearly designed for creatures with much larger and tougher hands than your own. Sometimes the work is almost comprehensible. You are loading ammunition into crates, or sorting piles of scrap into categories that make no sense to you, but apparently mean something to the mech boy who is overseeing the operation. Shouting incomprehensible instructions in Orcish, and occasionally throwing things at workers who fail to meet his inscrutable standards. Sometimes the work is completely baffling. You are carrying bizarre objects from one location to another for no apparent reason, or holding something in place while an Orc welds, bolts, or hammers something else to it. The purpose of the final product entirely opaque to your exhausted mind. And sometimes the work is dangerous to the point of absurdity. Orcs have no concept of workplace safety. They have no concept of careful handling of volatile materials, no concept of structural integrity standards, no concept of the idea that a living creature might need protection from molten metal, toxic fumes, unstable explosives, or heavy objects falling from great heights. Casualties among slave workers are staggeringly high, and the Orks treat these losses with the same casual indifference they show toward everything that is not directly related to fighting. A slave dies in a workshop accident. Clear the body, bring another one. A section of a construction project collapses and buries half the work crew. Dig them out if they are still alive. Step over them if they are not. Move on. There is always work to be done. The factories, in particular, are nightmarish places. When an Ork civilization reaches a certain size and complexity, it develops what can loosely be described as an industrial capacity. Crude manufacturing centers spring up, usually built around the workshop of a particularly ambitious mech boy, where weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and other war materials are produced in enormous quantities. These factories are powered by whatever energy sources the Orks can cobble together, from captured Imperial generators to engines ripped from wrecked vehicles, to bizarre contraptions that seem to run on nothing more than Ork optimism and a prayer to their twin gods, Gork and Mork. Inside these factories, the air is thick with smoke and sparks, and the acrid chemical stench of whatever substances the mech boys are using in their manufacturing process. The temperature is brutal, heat pouring from furnaces and forges, and the massive engines that drive the production lines. The noise is so loud that it physically hurts, a constant assault of hammering and grinding, and the shriek of metal being cut and shaped by hands that care nothing for precision. And in the middle of all this chaos, the slaves work, hauling raw materials to the assembly areas, operating crude machines under the supervision of Gretchen, who have been trained, in the loosest possible sense of the word, to keep the production line moving, assembling components that are handed to them by larger greenskins, their human fingers useful for tasks that are too fiddly for an Ork's massive digits. Cleaning up the constant detritus of industrial production, the metal shavings and spilled lubricant and discarded components that litter the factory floor in ankle-deep drifts. When a great crusade begins to span worlds instead of just continents, entire native populations are forced into slavery merely to manufacture ammunition for the Horde's guns. This is not an aberration. It is not an unusual occurrence. It is a standard feature of what happens when an Ork civilization grows large enough to require sustained industrial output. The war boss, Hruk Tief Splinter of the Snakebites clan, enslaved the entire population of the binary star system of Corva, forcing his captives to build him spacecraft with holds large enough to accommodate his beloved menagerie of enormous Squiggoth war beasts. He then went on to conquer 9 shrine worlds and use the grandest cathedral in the system as a breeding pen for those same creatures. This is not considered remarkable by Ork standards. This is just what Orks do when they need something built and cannot be bothered to do it themselves. The Orks on a captured Imperial vessel called the Rigorous demonstrated something particularly chilling about the nature of their slavery. Yet the human slaves aboard were kept without fences, without chains, without any of the traditional mechanisms of confinement.
Now, before we keep going, I just want to take a quick second to share something personal here. When I was putting this one together, reading through all the source material, the codex entries, the novels, the scattered bits of lore buried in campaign books, I genuinely had to step away from my desk a couple of times. And I do not say that for dramatic effect. The Orks are my favorite faction to talk about on this channel because there's always this tension between how funny they are on the surface and how absolutely nightmarish they become when you stop and really think about what they do. That contrast is what makes them such brilliant writing, in my opinion. Games Workshop managed to create a species that you can laugh at on a tabletop and then lose sleep over when you read the deeper lore. That is not easy to pull off, and I think it is one of the reasons the Orks have stayed so popular for decades. They work on every level, from the casual fan who thinks green football hooligans in space is a funny concept, all the way down to the lore obsessives like us who want to know what happens after the battle ends and the cameras stop rolling. But anyways, I just wanted to share that. Let's get back to the video.
The Orks simply did not bother. Their domination was so total, so overwhelming, so absolute, that physical restraints were unnecessary. The slaves had nowhere to go. They were aboard an Ork ship, deep in green skin-controlled space, surrounded by creatures that could tear them apart with their bare hands. The Orks gave them access to tools, because the tools were needed for labor, and they did not fear that the humans would turn those tools into weapons. What would be the point? A human with a wrench is no more threatening to an Ork than a Gretchen with a pointy stick. The power differential is simply too vast for resistance to be anything other than a briefly entertaining annoyance. But this is perhaps the most insidious aspect of Ork slavery. It is not maintained through complex systems of surveillance and control, like the vast bureaucracies of the Imperium. It is not maintained through fear of supernatural punishment, like the theocratic regimes of the ecclesiarchy. It is maintained through the simple, brutal, inescapable fact that the Orks are bigger than you, stronger than you, tougher than you, and more numerous than you, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. The chains are not on your body. They are in the mathematics of the situation. And mathematics does not care about your courage or your faith, or your burning desire for freedom. But manual labor, horrifying as it is not the worst thing that can happen to a prisoner of the Orks, not by a long way. Because the Orks have specialists whose interest in captive humans goes far beyond the simple exploitation of their ability to carry heavy things. These specialists have names that inspire dread even among other Orks. They are the Pain Boys, and if you are very, very unlucky, one of them will notice you. Pain Boys, sometimes called Mad Docs or simply Docs, are the medical practitioners of Ork society. The word medical should be understood in the loosest and most terrifying possible sense. A pain boy does not heal the sick and comfort the wounded in the way a human physician might. A pain boy is, first and foremost, an enthusiast, a hobbyist, a creature driven by an insatiable curiosity about how living things are put together and what happens when you take them apart. This curiosity is genetic, like all Ork oddboys. The pain boy is born with an innate understanding of his specialty. He knows, on an instinctive level, how bodies work. He knows which tubes connect to which organs. He knows how to amputate a limb and attach a mechanical replacement. He knows how to crack open a skull and poke around inside without killing the patient, usually. This knowledge is hardwired into his genetic code, a legacy of the ancient biological programming implanted by the Old Ones millions of years ago during the war in heaven. But here is the crucial thing about pain boy knowledge. It is instinctive, not careful. It is intuitive, not precise. A pain boy knows approximately how to perform surgery in the same way that a human baby knows approximately how to grasp objects. The basic impulse is there, but the execution is, to put it mildly, unreliable. Our pain boys are notorious even among other Orks for their tendency to get distracted during procedures, to experiment on patients without consent or warning, to replace the wrong body parts, to implant unnecessary modifications that serve no discernible purpose, and to generally treat their work as an opportunity for creative exploration rather than a service to the patient sitting on their table. The chief passions of the pain boy are surgery and extreme dentistry. The latter is often carried out during the former, as teeth are a commonly accepted form of payment for their services. They learn their craft through a mixture of genetic memory, trial and error, and the Ork concept of intuitive knowledge. Their greatest joy is conducting what they call experiments, and in many ways this makes the pain boy the biological equivalent of the mech boy. Where the mech boy takes apart machines and reassembles them in new configurations to see what happens, the pain boy does the same thing with living creatures. When it comes to their own kind, this is dangerous, but frequently survivable. Orks are phenomenally resilient creatures. Their biology allows them to withstand injuries that would kill any human several times over. An Ork can have his head removed, reattached to a different body entirely, and continue fighting with no apparent ill effects beyond a slight confusion about whose legs he is wearing. Limbs can be swapped, organs can be rearranged, and the Ork in question will likely survive the experience, although he may not be entirely pleased with the results when he wakes up and discovers that the arm he came in with has been replaced by a mechanical claw he did not ask for. Humans are considerably less durable, and this is what makes the Painboy's interest in captive humans so utterly, completely, soul-destroyingly terrifying. The desire to experiment is not limited to fellow greenskins. During battle, Painboys will actively seek out enemies to capture alive specifically for the purpose of later experimentation. The law records that they conduct all sorts of horrifying procedures and vivisections without anesthetic on screaming victims. Some victims are transformed into what the sources describe as horrifying cybernetic monstrosities, crude fusions of living flesh and orc technology that serve no apparent purpose beyond satisfying the Painboy's curiosity about what would happen if you grafted a machine to a screaming human. Others are simply taken apart, piece by piece, organ by organ, for no reason other than the Painboy's desire to see how the parts fit together and what noises the subject makes when you remove them. There is a subclass of Painboys known as bad docs, who are considered eccentric, even by the standards of their already eccentric profession. These are Painboys who have been cast out of their own tribes for the unnecessary surgery they inflict upon their patients. A victim who falls into the hands of a bad doc can find themselves with mechanical lungs they did not need, extra limbs grafted onto their body at random, or their head transplanted onto an entirely new body. For a bad doc, there is no need for payment. The surgery itself is the reward. The act of opening up a living creature and rearranging its components is its own satisfaction, and the screaming is just background music. As some particularly ambitious Painboys have even attempted to capture space marines, those towering, genetically enhanced super soldiers of the Imperium, in order to study their gene seed and potentially produce a strain of even hardier orcs. Mad Doc Grotznik, one of the most notorious Painboys in the galaxy, is reported to have captured Primaris Marines from the Silver Templars chapter for exactly this purpose. If even the finest warriors of humanity are not safe from the Painboy's table, what hope does an ordinary human prisoner have? The answer, spoken plainly, is none. Picture the Painboy's workshop. It is not a sterile medical facility with gleaming instruments and clean white walls. It is a charnel house, a blood-spattered cavern of crude metal and stained surfaces, where rusty tools hang from hooks alongside things that were once patients and are now something else entirely. The air is thick with the smell of blood and whatever foul-smelling fungal solution the Painboys use in place of proper disinfectant. In corners and on shelves, jars filled with murky liquid contain specimens that you very much do not want to look at too closely, but cannot stop yourself from looking at anyway, because some part of your mind needs to know what might be about to happen to you. The operating table is a slab of metal, scarred and pitted from years of use, with restraints that are clearly designed for creatures much larger than a human being. The tools are a collection of saws, drills, clamps, probes, and cutting implements that look like they belong in a torture chamber rather than a medical facility, which in effect is exactly what they are. The Painboy's personal instrument, the one he carries into battle and uses both as a medical tool and a weapon, is called a stabby bit, and the name tells you everything you need to know about the orc approach to medicine. The Painboy does not see this as cruelty. This is an important thing to understand, because it is central to the entire experience of orc captivity. The Painboy is not torturing you because he enjoys your suffering, although he certainly does not mind it. He is not punishing you for being human or for fighting against his kind. He is simply following his nature, exploring his craft, indulging the curiosity that is as much a part of his identity as fighting is a part of an ordinary orc boy. Your screams are just background noise, yet no more significant to him than the sound of a motor running or a hammer striking metal. You are not a person to him. You are a project, a collection of interesting parts that happen to be arranged in a configuration he has not encountered before. Nothing more, nothing less. And this, perhaps, is the most horrifying thing of all. Not the pain, not the disfigurement, not the casual disposal of your body when the experiment is complete and your usefulness has been exhausted, but the absolute, total, unwavering indifference with which it is all carried out. To the pain boy, you matter less than a malfunctioning engine. At least an engine is useful. The mech boys present their own particular dangers to human captives, though they are generally less directly threatening than the pain boys. A mech boy is an orc engineer, a creature born with an innate understanding of mechanical and technological principles that would take a human decades of formal education to develop. They can build engines, generators, weapons, vehicles, and void-capable spacecraft using nothing but salvaged scrap and their own instinctive genius. Their workshops are crowded, dangerous, fire-prone places where the boundaries between brilliant invention and catastrophic failure are so thin as to be essentially non-existent. Human slaves in a mech boy's workshop are prized for one specific quality above all others: their hands. Human fingers are smaller and more dexterous than orc fingers, making them useful for the kind of fine, detailed work that the mech boy's own massive digits cannot easily manage. Wiring circuits, threading cables, assembling small components, manipulating delicate mechanisms. These are tasks that a human can perform more efficiently than either an orc or a Gretchen, and a pragmatic mech boy will keep a stable of human workers for exactly this purpose. The work is exhausting and dangerous. The mech boy's creations are volatile by nature, prone to power surges, short circuits, small explosions, and sudden structural failures that can kill everyone in a 10-meter radius. The materials being handled are often toxic, corrosive, or superheated to temperatures that can burn through human flesh in an instant. The mech boy himself, lost in the creative frenzy of construction, has a tendency to forget that his human workers are fragile creatures who cannot survive being hit by a falling engine block or doused in burning lubricant. Casualties are frequent, and replacements are drawn from the general slave population without ceremony or comment. But there is a strange dynamic at work in the mech boy's workshop that does not exist elsewhere in orc captivity. Among all the various roles that a human slave might be forced to fill, working for a mech boy is sometimes described by the rare survivors as the closest thing to tolerable. Not because the work is easy or safe, but because a mech boy who has found a human worker with useful skills has a vested interest in keeping that worker alive and functional. The mech boy may not care about the human as a person, but he cares very much about the human's ability to perform tasks that are useful to his projects. This means that a skilled worker might receive slightly better treatment, slightly more food, slightly less random abuse, than the general slave population. In the nightmarish economy of orc captivity, this passes for privilege. There is even a recorded instance of a captured Imperial tech priest being bribed with material incentives, including the offer of human females as companions, to assist an orc war boss with a particular technological project. The orcs, in their crude but pragmatic way, understood that some humans could be motivated by rewards rather than threats alone, and they were willing to exploit that understanding when it served their purposes. The freebooter known as Uzgul admitted to favoring Eldari slaves over human ones, reasoning that humans typically only survived for a short time and needed to be replaced frequently, while the Eldari had a greater will to live and more hidden strength for forced labor. Uzgul kept the spirit stones of his Eldari slaves hostage as leverage, demonstrating a level of cunning and understanding of alien psychology that most orcs would never bother to develop. Now let us talk about food. Because if there is one thing that defines the daily experience of an orc prisoner more than anything else, more than the work, more than the abuse, more than the constant noise and chaos, it is hunger. The gnawing, hollow, relentless hunger that becomes the backdrop of every waking moment and the subject of every fitful dream. The orcs are, among many other things, a fungal species. Their entire ecosystem is based on fungi. The food they eat, the beer they drink, the squigs they breed for various purposes, All of it grows from the same fungal substrate that permeates every orc settlement like a living carpet spread across every surface. This fungus grows rapidly and abundantly, fueled by waste materials and organic matter, and it provides the orcs with a reliable, if unappetizing, food source that requires minimal maintenance. Human slaves are fed from this same fungal supply, but they receive the absolute minimum necessary to keep them alive and working. The standard slave ration is a handful of fungal mash, a thick, greyish-green paste with a texture like wet clay and a taste that survivors describe in terms that range from indescribable to worse than anything you can possibly imagine. It is nutritionally adequate in the barest technical sense, providing just enough calories and nutrients to prevent immediate starvation, but nowhere near enough to sustain a human body engaged in heavy manual labor day after day, week after week. The result is a slow, grinding physical decline that is one of the defining features of long-term orc captivity. Prisoners lose weight rapidly, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue for fuel when the meager rations prove insufficient. Their immune systems weaken, leaving them vulnerable to infections and diseases that their captors' alien biology is entirely immune to. Wounds heal slowly, if they heal at all, and every scrape and cut becomes a potential death sentence as the body loses its ability to fight off even the most basic infections. Bones become brittle. Teeth loosen and fall out, which carries a particular irony in a society where teeth are the primary unit of currency. Hair thins. The human body are pushed beyond its limits and denied the resources it needs to repair itself, simply begins to shut down, one system at a time, like the lights going out in a vast building during a power failure. The squigs, those ubiquitous creatures of the orc ecosystem, are both a potential food source and a potential threat for human slaves. There are many varieties of squig, each bred for a different purpose by the runthirds and snakebite breeders, who maintain the orc menageries. Eating squigs, the most basic variety, are essentially limbless blobs of edible flesh that feed on fungus and are in turn eaten by the orcs. If a slave can get their hands on a squig, they have a protein source that is considerably more nourishing than fungal mash alone. But squigs are orc property, and stealing one is punishable by whatever form of violence the nearest orc feels like administering at that particular moment. Other varieties of squig are significantly less helpful to the enterprising prisoner. Attack squigs are ferociously toothed little monsters that are used as weapons and guard animals. Squig hounds, larger and more aggressive still, are used by runthirds to chase down fleeing slaves, and they are very, very good at their job. Being hunted by a squig hound is an experience that combines the terror of being chased by a predator with the certain knowledge that the creature pursuing you can outrun you, outfight you, and will not stop until it has either caught you or been called off by its handler. The runthird breeds and trains these animals with a care and attention that he would never waste on a human slave. Because the squig hound is, in the runthird's estimation, considerably more valuable. The orc economy runs on teeth, specifically on the large, sharp, ivory-like fangs that orcs shed and regrow throughout their lives in a manner similar to sharks. These teeth, or teeth as the orcs call them, serve as the universal currency of greenskin society. A single tooth will buy a squig pie and a tankard of fungus beer. A bag of teeth will buy a cheap war buggy. A big, flashy battle wagon could cost a war boss hundreds of teeth. The teeth degrade over time, making it impossible to hoard wealth, which keeps the economy in a state of perpetual circulation and ensures that no orc can accumulate too much purchasing power without spending it quickly. Human teeth, it should be noted, are considered worthless in this economy. They are too small, too flat, and too fiddly to serve as currency. The teeth of other intelligent races, such as the Eldari, are similarly dismissed. Only proper orc fangs have any real value, which means that a human slave exists in a strange economic limbo, living within a functional economy but having no means of participating in it. You cannot earn money because you have nothing to sell that the orcs want. You cannot buy food because you have no currency with which to purchase it. You exist entirely outside the economic system, dependent on whatever scraps your masters choose to provide, which is very little indeed. But the grimmest fate related to food in Orc captivity is not starvation. It is something far worse, because in certain Orc civilizations, and particularly those that have grown large enough and stable enough to develop what might be called an agricultural capacity, humans are not just workers. They are not just slaves. They are livestock. The lore describes breeding populations of humans kept by Orcs for the sole purpose of being used as food. These human livestock are kept in complete darkness, the only time they see light being when food or water is brought to their enclosed communal pens. Over time, deprived of stimulation, purpose, and any semblance of meaningful contact with the outside world, these captives degenerate into something barely recognizable as human. They stop speaking. They stop communicating in any recognizable way. They grunt and make noises, behaving more like animals than people. Their teeth, nails, and hair are all removed by their keepers to prevent them from harming themselves or each other, because the Orcs want their livestock healthy and intact until the moment of consumption arrives. This is, without question, one of the darkest corners of Orc lore. It is a reminder that for all their comedic qualities, for all the funny accents and the painted vehicles and the ridiculous weapons, the Orcs are a species that views other intelligent beings as nothing more than resources to be exploited. The fact that they can breed and raise sentient creatures as livestock without any apparent moral qualm or even the faintest awareness that there might be something wrong with doing so speaks to the fundamental alien nature of the Orc mind. They are not evil in the way that chaos is evil. Driven by malice and corruption and the whispered promises of dark gods, they are not evil in the way that the Dark Eldar are evil, pursuing cruelty as an art form and a survival mechanism. They are simply indifferent. Human suffering is not something they enjoy or something they seek out for its own sake. It is something they do not notice, because humans, to an Orc, are not really people. They are things. Small, weak, easily broken things that sometimes make funny noises when you poke them and occasionally prove useful for carrying heavy objects from one place to another. There is another dimension of life in Orc captivity that we need to discuss, and it is the one that most directly demonstrates the Orc attitude toward prisoners as entertainment rather than just resources. The fighting pits. Orcs love fighting. This is the most fundamental fact of their existence, the core truth around which everything else in their civilization orbits. They love the noise of it, the chaos of it, the bone-jarring impact of fist against face and blade against armor. They love it so much that when there are no enemies available to fight, they will happily fight each other, and they do so constantly. Orc settlements are filled with perpetual low-level violence. As individual Orcs settle disputes, establish dominance, or simply relieve boredom through enthusiastic brawls that can range from a friendly wrestling match to a full-scale riot involving hundreds of participants and lasting for days. And sometimes, for variety, the Orcs involve their prisoners in this entertainment. The fighting pits, crude arenas dug into the ground or assembled from scrap metal and salvaged wreckage, are a feature of many larger Orc settlements. Here, prisoners are forced to fight each other, or to fight Gretchen, or squigs, or captured wild animals, or whatever else the Orcs can throw into the ring to make the spectacle more interesting. The bouts are watched by crowds of bellowing, cheering greenskins who place bets on the outcome using teeth, the enamel currency that drives their economy. The noise is staggering, a wall of sound generated by hundreds or thousands of massive green bodies packed together and screaming their approval or displeasure at whatever is happening in the pit below. For the prisoner forced into the fighting pit, the experience is a distillation of everything that makes Orc captivity so fundamentally dehumanizing. Yet you are surrounded by enemies on all sides, a ring of green faces staring down at you with expressions that range from eager anticipation to barely contained excitement. You are armed, if at all, with whatever crude weapon the Orcs have deemed sufficient to make the fight interesting, which might be a rusty blade, a length of pipe, or simply your own bare fists. Your opponent may be another human prisoner, in which case you face the soul-destroying choice of killing one of your own kind for the entertainment of aliens, or a creature whose capabilities you cannot predict, and whose fighting instincts far outstrip your own. The crowd roars with a sound like a living thunderstorm, their excitement feeding into the collective psychic field that all orcs generate, by filling the air with an electric charge of savage joy that you can almost feel pressing against your skin like a physical weight. The orcs are not watching because they want to see you suffer. They are watching because they want to see a fight. The distinction is important because it illustrates the fundamental nature of the orc relationship with violence. To an orc, fighting is not a means to an end. It is the end. The fight is the point, the winner, the loser, the stakes. These things are secondary to the pure, visceral pleasure of watching two creatures try to destroy each other. If you win, you live. You are thrown back into the slave population, possibly with slightly better rations for a few days. The orcs recognizing your entertainment value and wanting to keep you in fighting shape for the next bout. If you lose but survive, or you are patched up by whatever Gretchen happens to be assigned to the task and thrown back into the general labor pool to recover as best you can. If you lose and die, your body is removed to make way for the next fight, and no one, not the orcs, not the Gretchen, not even your fellow prisoners, can afford to spare you more than a passing thought. There are always more where you came from. There are always more bodies to fill the pit. Some prisoners develop a reputation in the pits. A human who wins consistently, who puts on a good show, who fights with enough ferocity and skill to impress the greenskin audience, can become something of a minor celebrity in the camp. These fighters receive better food, better treatment, even a grudging kind of respect from the orcs who oversee them. But this status is a double-edged blade, because a popular pit fighter is also a valuable commodity, and the orcs will keep sending you back into the arena until your luck runs out. No one wins forever. The pit always claims its own in the end. The psychological impact of the fighting pits extends far beyond the prisoners who actually participate in them. Even for those who are never selected to fight, the knowledge that the pits exist, that at any moment you might be grabbed by a runthird and thrown into a ring to fight for your life against another terrified human or a snarling squig, is a constant source of anxiety that poisons whatever scraps of mental peace you might otherwise have found. The pits are a reminder that your life has no value to your captors beyond whatever entertainment or labor you can provide. You are not a person, you are a resource. And resources are used up and discarded when they are no longer useful. Now let us talk about what life is like aboard an orc void vessel. Because for many prisoners, captivity does not take place on the surface of a planet. It takes place in the cramped, stinking, impossibly dangerous interior of an orc ship, drifting through the cold void of space. And this environment presents its own unique and terrible set of horrors that surface-bound prisoners never have to face. An orc ship is, to put it charitably, a disaster waiting to happen. It is a conglomeration of stolen, salvaged, and improvised components, welded and bolted and roped together into something that vaguely resembles a spacecraft, in the same way that a pile of rocks vaguely resembles a cathedral. The interior is a labyrinth of corridors, chambers, and crawl spaces that seem to have been arranged by someone with no concept of logical design, which in a sense they were. Bulkheads are sealed, then opened, then sealed again as the orcs rearrange the ship's internal architecture on a whim. Entire sections may be depressurized, flooded with toxic runoff, on fire, or infested with hostile wildlife at any given time, and the orcs' response to these conditions ranges from casual indifference to enthusiastic participation. The air aboard an orc ship is, if possible, worse than the air in an orc ground camp. It is recycled through systems that are barely functional at the best of times, thick with the exhaust fumes of 100 different engines and generators, tainted by the emissions of the orc fungal ecosystem that spreads through every surface like a living skin, and flavored with the accumulated stench of thousands of unwashed greenskin bodies packed into a space that was not designed to hold them. Breathing this air for extended periods causes headaches, nausea, and a persistent low-grade dizziness that makes it difficult to maintain your balance, which is already challenging given the ship's unreliable artificial gravity. The gravity itself is another constant hazard that prisoners aboard Ork ships must contend with. Ork vessels do not have the smooth, consistent gravitational fields generated by Imperial grav plates. Instead, they have whatever the mech boy in charge of the engineering section has managed to cobble together from salvaged parts and optimistic guesswork, which varies from section to section and sometimes from moment to moment. In one corridor, you might feel like you weigh twice your normal weight, your legs buckling under the strain of carrying your own body. In the next, you might feel almost weightless, your feet barely maintaining contact with the deck plates. And in some sections, the gravity simply fails entirely, and you find yourself floating in a dark, stinking void, bumping into walls and debris and the occasional dead creature until you manage to pull yourself to a section where the gravity has decided to work again. It was aboard such a vessel, a massive space hulk, serving as the flagship of the Ork warlord, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, that the most famous episode of human captivity in Ork hands took place. The story of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick's imprisonment and subsequent rebellion is one of the great tales of the 41st millennium, and it deserves to be told in full because it illustrates both the horror of Ork captivity and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit under conditions that would break almost anyone else. Yarrick was captured after the disastrous Battle of Golgotha, a campaign that the Commissar himself had organized to hunt down and destroy Gazkul once and for all. The pursuit had lasted 10 standard years, during which Gazgakul had led the Imperial forces on a grueling chase across multiple star systems, deliberately staying just out of reach, deliberately exhausting his pursuers, deliberately sacrificing his own subordinates to keep the Imperials engaged. When the trap was finally sprung on Golgotha, the Imperial forces were tired, overstretched, and wholly unprepared for the second Ork army that hit them from behind, while Gazkul's main force engaged from the front. The battle was a massacre. The Imperial defenders were destroyed almost to the last soldier, and the few survivors, including Yarrick himself, were taken prisoner. Yarrick was stripped of his famous power claw and his bionic laser eye, then thrown down the garbage chute of Gazkul's space hulk, plummeting into the refuse-filled depths where Orks themselves had never survived the fall. For several days, Yarrick fought his way through the hulk's lower sections, hunting squigs for food and using their oversized quills as improvised tools to build a ladder back up the waste chute. When he finally emerged, battered and filthy, and half-starved but very much alive, he found Gazkul waiting for him. The war boss had predicted that the human would survive. He had in fact used Yarrick's survival as a demonstration of his own ability to understand and predict human behavior, cementing his authority over the other Orks, who had doubted such a small, weak creature could endure what had been done to him. Yarrick was then thrown among the other human slave prisoners on the space hulk, and here, the Commissar did what Commissars do best. He organized. Quickly assessing his situation, Yarrick set about building a revolt among the human captives. The slave work crews, used haphazardly by the Orks to perform various tasks throughout the hulk, had managed over time to crudely map large portions of the vessel's interior. Yarrick used this knowledge to plan an uprising, leading the slaves in a desperate assault toward what he believed to be the hulk's command center. The revolt was audacious and desperate, and ultimately unsuccessful in its primary objective. Yarrick did not kill Gazkul. He did not destroy the space hulk, but he came close enough to cause significant damage, activating all of the hulk's propulsion systems simultaneously in an attempt to tear the vessel apart from the inside. The resulting explosion damaged a large portion of the hulk and demonstrated to the assembled Orks that Gazkul had indeed been correct about the human's capabilities. And then, something extraordinary happened. Yarrick woke up, days later, to find that his bionics had been restored. His power claw was back on his arm. His laser eye was back in its socket. and he had been healed and repaired by Mad Doc Grotznik at Gazkul's orders. The war boss had the commissar escorted by hundreds of cheering orcs to an intact shuttlecraft and allowed him to leave, telling him to go back to the Imperium and prepare for the orcs' return to Armageddon. The captured Imperial commanders who had been taken alongside Yarrick were not so fortunate. Their flesh was fused to a captured Imperial shuttle transport, transformed into living servitors who were forced to pilot the vessel that carried Yarrick back to Imperial space. It was a final, grotesque demonstration of Orc dominance, a message that said, "We understand you better than you understand yourselves, and there is nothing you can do to stop us." Yarrick's experience is extraordinary in every sense of the word. It is extraordinary because of his survival, his resilience, his ability to organize a revolt under conditions that would have broken almost any other human being who has ever lived. But it is also extraordinary in its rarity. For every Yarrick who fights his way out of Orc captivity through sheer force of will and tactical genius, there are millions of nameless prisoners who simply endure until they cannot endure any longer, and then they are gone. No dramatic escape, no heroic last stand, just a body in a waste pile. Another entry in the endless ledger of human suffering that the galaxy produces in such staggering quantities that no archive could ever contain it all. The psychological toll of Orc captivity deserves its own discussion, separate from the physical hardships, because it is arguably the most devastating and least understood aspect of the entire experience. The body can adapt to terrible conditions. Given enough time, it adjusts to reduced rations, to constant labor, to chronic pain. The human organism is a remarkably resilient machine, capable of enduring deprivations that would seem impossible in the abstract. But the mind is a different matter entirely. The first and most immediate psychological challenge facing any new prisoner is the sheer alienness of the environment. Everything about Orc civilization is designed for Orcs, by Orcs, with Orcs as the only intended users. The architecture is too large, built to accommodate creatures that stand over 2 meters tall and weigh 3 times what a human weighs. The tools are too heavy, forged for hands that could crush stone. The food is barely edible by human standards. The language is incomprehensible. Our guttural barking dialect that sounds like someone gargling gravel while being punched repeatedly in the throat. The social norms are violent, arbitrary, and completely unpredictable by any standard a human might apply. A human in Orc captivity exists in a perpetual state of disorientation. You cannot understand what is being said around you. You cannot predict what will happen next. You cannot communicate effectively with your captors, and even if you could, they would not care what you had to say. You cannot influence your own situation in any meaningful way. You are a leaf caught in a river, carried along by forces that are utterly indifferent to your existence, swept toward a destination that you cannot see and would not want to reach even if you could. This sense of helplessness, of being completely at the mercy of beings who neither understand nor care about your experience, is profoundly destabilizing to the human psyche. We are social creatures. We need to feel connected to others, to have a sense of purpose and agency, to believe that our actions have consequences and that we possess some measure of control over our own lives. In Orc captivity, all of these fundamental needs go unmet. You are not part of a community in any meaningful sense. You are not working toward a goal that you chose or understand. Your actions have no impact on your situation beyond the most immediate and basic level of compliance or punishment. You are a cog in a machine that does not even recognize your existence as significant enough to acknowledge. The relationships between prisoners become, for many captives, the only thing that keeps them tethered to sanity. The bonds formed in the slave pens are intense and fragile, forged in the crucible of shared suffering and constantly threatened by the random violence of their captors. Prisoners form small groups, usually based on shared origin, a squad that was captured together, civilians from the same city, soldiers from the same regiment, and these groups become lifelines in the truest sense of the word. They share food when they can spare it. They watch each other's backs during work details, warning of approaching orcs or alerting each other to hazards in the work environment. They take turns keeping watch while others sleep, guarding against the Gretchen who prowl the slave pens at night, looking for easy targets. They provide the emotional support that no one else in the camp will offer, us whispering encouragement in the dark, holding a trembling hand, repeating a name so that it will not be forgotten when its owner is gone. But these bonds are also a source of terrible pain. When a member of your group is taken by a pain boy and never returns, or beaten to death by a bored orc who happened to be passing by, or simply fails to wake up one morning because their body has finally given out under the strain, the grief is compounded by the certainty that there is absolutely nothing you could have done to prevent it. Loss becomes the rhythm of daily life in the slave camp, a steady drumbeat of absence and mourning that wears away at the soul, the way water wears away stone, slowly and imperceptibly, until one day you look down and realize that there is almost nothing left. Some prisoners cope by withdrawing entirely, refusing to form attachments, treating every other human in the camp as a stranger whose fate is not their concern and whose name is not worth learning. These prisoners survive longer, in many cases, because they have insulated themselves from the cumulative weight of grief that destroys so many others. But they survive at a cost, becoming hollow shells that function mechanically but have lost the capacity for the emotional connections that make life worth living. They work, they eat, they sleep, and they feel nothing at all. And in that emptiness, they begin to resemble the very machines that the orcs build, functional but devoid of anything that could be called a soul. Others cope by doubling down on connection, clinging to whatever relationships they can form with a desperate intensity that is both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. These are the prisoners who organize prayer circles in the slave pens, who share their last scrap of food with a sick companion, who sing quietly in the dark when no one is listening, who hold the hand of a dying friend and whisper words of comfort that they may not fully believe, but that they offer anyway, because the alternative is silence, and silence in the slave camp is the sound of giving up. Faith in the emperor, that bedrock of imperial society, is tested in captivity in ways that no sermon or catechism could have prepared for. The imperial creed teaches that the emperor protects, that those who serve him faithfully will be shielded from the worst that the galaxy can throw at them. For a guardsman standing in a trench, waiting for the order to advance, this faith is a powerful motivator. It provides comfort, purpose, and the courage to face impossible odds with something approaching calm. But in an orc slave camp, where the emperor's protection is conspicuous by its absence, where every day brings new suffering and no prayer seems to be answered, that faith is put to a test that many cannot pass. Some prisoners cling to their faith with a ferocity that borders on mania, reciting hymns and litanies under their breath as they work, finding in the familiar words a shield against the horror of their situation. For these prisoners, faith becomes not just a comfort, but a survival mechanism, a way of maintaining their identity and their sense of purpose in an environment that is designed, however inadvertently, to strip both away. The act of prayer is an act of defiance. The recitation of a hymn is a statement that says, I am still here, I am still human, I still belong to something larger than this nightmare. Others find that their faith simply cannot survive what they see with their own eyes. They look around at the suffering, the degradation, the absolute indifference of the universe to their pain, and they cannot reconcile what they see with what they have been taught to believe. The emperor protects, they were told, but he is not protecting them now. He is not protecting the man who just had his arm torn off by a bored knob. He is not protecting the woman who was dragged away by a pain boy and has not been seen since. He is not protecting the children who were born in the breeding pens and have never seen daylight and never will. Where is the protection? Where is the mercy? Where is the golden light of the Astronomicon in the darkness of the slave camp? For some, this loss of faith is a quiet, gradual process, a slow dimming of the inner light that they hardly notice until it is gone entirely, and they are left standing in the dark with nothing to hold on to. For others, it is a sudden, catastrophic collapse, a single moment of clarity in which the comforting structure of belief shatters like glass and leaves nothing behind but the cold, empty, indifferent reality of their situation. There is a particular cruelty in the way that Ork captivity attacks the human sense of time. The Orks do not keep a schedule that corresponds to anything a human would recognize. There is no meaningful distinction between day and night in many Ork settlements, or if there is, it bears no relationship to work schedules, which are dictated entirely by whatever the nearest Ork authority figures decide they want done at any given moment. You might work for what feels like 20 hours, then be allowed to rest for 3, then be roused again for another indefinite period of labor. The rhythm of existence becomes arrhythmic, a stuttering, unpredictable sequence of effort and exhaustion that destroys your ability to track the passage of time. Prisoners lose track of days first, then weeks, then months. The passage of time becomes a blur of identical suffering, one meal blending into the next, one work shift indistinguishable from the one before it or the one that will follow. Without the ability to mark time, prisoners lose their sense of narrative, their feeling that their life is a story moving forward through time towards some destination, however uncertain that destination might be. Instead, existence becomes a flat, featureless plane of endless present, stretching in all directions without landmark or horizon. The past becomes unreliable. Memories of life before capture fading and distorting until they feel like someone else's dreams, half-remembered and oddly unreal, as though they happened to a different person in a different universe. The future becomes inconceivable because planning for the future requires the ability to imagine a different state of affairs, and in the slave camp, nothing ever changes. There is only this. There is only now. There is only the next breath, the next step, the next blow. As for those prisoners who maintain enough mental coherence to observe their surroundings with something approaching curiosity rather than numb terror, the Ork camp provides a kind of grim education in xenology that no imperial briefing could ever match. You learn things about the greenskins that are not in any textbook, because you learn them not from reports and dossiers, but from direct, daily, intimate exposure to a species that most humans only ever encounter through the sights of a weapon. You learn that Orks communicate as much through body language and volume as through actual words. Their spoken language, a guttural, shouting dialect that sounds like rocks being ground together in a metal drum, is only part of how they interact. Posture matters enormously. Size matters. The angle of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the way an Ork plants his feet when he is challenging another for dominance. All of these physical cues carry meaning that is as important as any word. Over time, some prisoners develop a rough understanding of Ork body language, enough to predict when a beating is coming and get out of the way, or to identify which Orks are relatively safe to be near and which are actively looking for something to hurt. You learn about their twin gods, Gork and Mork, who are described variously as one being cunningly brutal and the other being brutally cunning, though no two Orks seem to agree on which is which, and the distinction may in fact be meaningless. You learn that Ork religion, such as it is, revolves around these two divine figures who embody the qualities that Orks value most, strength and trickery. Yet you learn that the massive idols and totems that dot every Ork settlement, crude representations of leering green faces with tusked jaws, are not merely decorative. They are focal points for the psychic energy that all Orks generate, amplifying the collective field that binds their civilization together and powers their technology in ways that imperial science cannot fully explain. You also learn, gradually and painfully, about the Ork concept of humor. Because Orks do have a sense of humor, and it is, like everything else about them, crude, violent, and deeply unsettling when you are on the receiving end of it. Orc humor is based primarily on things going wrong in spectacular and ideally explosive fashion. An orc finds it hilarious when a vehicle crashes at high speed. He finds it hilarious when a weapon explodes in someone's face, but especially if the someone is standing nearby and gets covered in soot. He finds it hilarious when someone is launched unexpectedly into the air by a detonation. He finds it hilarious when a fight breaks out for a stupid reason and escalates far beyond all proportion. Because escalation is, to an orc, one of the funniest things that can happen. They laugh at pain, both their own and others, not out of sadism in the human sense, but out of a genuine, deeply felt appreciation for the comedy of physical misfortune. For human slaves, this sense of humor is a constant source of additional torment, because the orcs find humans inherently amusing. The way you run is funny to them, all those tiny legs pumping frantically. The way you flinch when something loud happens is funny. The way you try to pick up objects that are clearly too heavy for your frail little body is deeply, deeply funny. The noises you make when you are hurt are funny. Your entire existence, from the orc perspective, is a long-running comedy show featuring the galaxy's smallest and most easily startled performers. And the fact that you do not seem to be enjoying the performance as much as the audience only makes the whole thing funnier. Gretchen, who exist in a similar subordinate position relative to the orcs, have developed sophisticated coping mechanisms for dealing with this kind of attention. They play along with their master's humor, hamming up their reactions, performing exaggerated pratfalls, and making themselves into willing participants in the joke in order to gain a measure of control over the situation and deflect the worst of the abuse. Some human slaves eventually learn to do the same, adopting a kind of forced clownishness that satisfies the orc appetite for comedy and reduces the frequency and severity of random violence directed at them. But for most prisoners, the experience of being laughed at by creatures that have taken everything from you, of being treated as entertainment by the very beings who are destroying your body and your mind and your spirit, is a form of psychological abuse that words struggle to adequately describe. Now, we should acknowledge that not all experiences of orc captivity are identical. The treatment a prisoner receives can vary enormously depending on which orc clan has captured them, what the local war boss values, and what particular role the prisoner has been assigned within the greenskin economy. Let us take some time to explore how the different major clans approach the question of prisoners and slaves, because the differences, while subtle by orc standards, can mean the difference between a captivity measured in months and one measured in hours. The Goths are the biggest, toughest, and most brutally straightforward of all the orc clans. They live for close combat above all else, and their idea of a perfect afternoon is charging headlong into the thickest part of a battle and smashing everything within arm's reach with their bare fists, or with whatever blunt, heavy object happens to be at hand. Goth orcs wear black, favor plain and unadorned equipment, and view the flashy decorations and colorful paint schemes of other clans as frivolous wastes of time and teeth. A Goth would rather have a bigger chopper than a prettier one, and he will tell you so at considerable volume. For a prisoner, being captured by the Goths is both the simplest and possibly the shortest experience of orc captivity you can have. Goths have little patience for the complexities of slave management. They want workers who work, fighters who fight, and everything else is a distraction from the important business of punching things. A Goth slave camp is a place of blunt, direct, and entirely predictable cruelty, where prisoners are beaten for any failure and worked until they drop. There is no experimentation, no elaborate breeding programs, no sophisticated conditioning techniques. There is just work, and in punishment for not working, and the constant looming presence of the largest and most physically imposing orcs in the galaxy, who view the management of slaves as a tedious chore that they would much rather delegate to someone else so they can get back to fighting. The lifespan of a slave in a Goth camp is, on average, quite short. The work is punishing, the treatment is brutal, and the Goths' complete lack of interest in maintaining their workforce means that prisoners are used up and discarded with an efficiency that is almost industrial in its thoroughness. When the current batch of slaves is exhausted, the Goths simply go out and capture more. It is not a sustainable system by any reasonable standard of economic planning, but sustainability is not a concept that features prominently in the Goth worldview, which can be summarized fairly accurately as hit things until they stop moving, then find more things to hit. The Snakebites are, in many ways, the most unsettling clan for a human prisoner to encounter, precisely because they are the most methodical. They are considered the most primitive and traditional of all the Orc clans, favoring old ways and natural methods over technology. Where other clans build factories and workshops, the Snakebites build pens and breeding grounds. They are expert breeders of squigs and other orcoid creatures, maintaining vast menageries of biological assets that they manage with a care and attention that is genuinely impressive, even if the end result of all that careful management is a more efficient way to produce warbeasts the size of buildings. For human captives, the Snakebite experience is distinctive in its own grim way. The Snakebites are the clan most likely to treat human slaves as animals in the most literal possible sense. They apply the same techniques of breeding, feeding, and management to their human captives that they use for their squig herds, viewing the two populations as fundamentally similar resources that differ only in their specific utility. Under Snakebite captivity, you are not a person, not even a worker, in the way that other clans might use that term. You are livestock, managed, fed, bred, and ultimately consumed according to the needs and whims of your green-skinned herdmasters. The Snakebite approach to slavery is more organized and more sustainable than the Goth approach, which means that prisoners in Snakebite camps tend to live longer. But longevity in this context is not a mercy. It simply means that the horror of captivity is extended over a greater period of time, the degradation drawn out and deepened as the prisoner is progressively reduced from a human being to an animal in the eyes of their captors and, eventually, in their own eyes as well. The Snakebites do not break their slaves quickly and violently the way the Goths do. They break them slowly and methodically through a process of sustained dehumanization that strips away identity, dignity, and ultimately sanity, layer by layer, until nothing remains but a creature that eats when fed and moves when prodded and has forgotten that it ever had a name. The Blood Axes are the most cunning and strategically sophisticated of the Orc clans, and they are widely despised by other Orcs for being un-Orky in their methods. They use camouflage, they employ battle plans, they retreat from unfavorable engagements rather than throwing themselves headlong into certain defeat. And most shockingly of all, they trade openly with the forces of the Imperium, exchanging goods and services across the species boundary in a way that other clans find deeply offensive and fundamentally wrong. The Blood Axes understand humans better than any other Orc clan, having had more contact with them over the centuries, and this understanding extends to how they manage their slaves. A human captive under Blood Axe control might, paradoxically, have a slightly better experience than one held by other clans. Not because the Blood Axes are more merciful, because they are not, but because they are more practical. They understand, in a way that other clans do not, that a human who is properly fed and not beaten to within an inch of his life every single day will produce more work over a longer period of time than one who is starving and broken. They understand that certain humans possess skills that are valuable and that those skills are lost permanently when the human dies. A Blood Axe Runtherd might employ what amounts to a carrot and stick approach, rewarding productive slaves with extra rations or slightly better living conditions while punishing underperformers with the usual Orc methods of physical correction. This does not make Blood Axe captivity pleasant. Let me be very clear about that. It simply makes it marginally more survivable than the alternatives, and in the calculus of Orc slavery, but where the question is rarely will I be comfortable, and almost always will I survive another day, that margin can mean the difference between living long enough to see rescue or dying on a factory floor with no one to remember your name. The Evil Sons are the speed-obsessed clan, the ones who live by the sacred orc maxim that red ones go faster, and who express their devotion to velocity through an unending parade of customized vehicles, souped-up engines, and high-speed rampages across whatever landscape happens to be available. For their slaves, this obsession with speed translates into a particular kind of hazard that other clans' prisoners do not face. Evil Sons' slaves are often put to work in the vehicle workshops and racing camps that are the beating heart of Evil Sons' culture, and maintaining and building the machines that these orcs value above almost everything else, including, quite possibly, fighting itself. The danger here is not just the physical labor, which is punishing enough on its own. It is the casual, almost accidental violence that accompanies the Evil Sons' lifestyle. Speed freaks, as the most vehicle-obsessed orcs are called, have a habit of testing their machines at maximum speed in close proximity to whoever happens to be standing nearby, which frequently includes their slaves. Being run over by an orc warbike, traveling at 200 kilometers per hour because the rider was testing a new engine modification and did not bother to check whether anyone was in the way, is a very real and very common cause of death among Evil Sons captives. The Evil Sons war boss, known as Skargrim Ruknar, and his burning death speed freaks were particularly notorious for their treatment of captured humans during the Third War for Armageddon. They encircled entire regiments of Imperial guardsmen in the ash wastes, herding the trapped humans into large groups, and then setting up massed runs with flame-throwing vehicles, burning the captives alive in a spectacle that lit up the night skies. Squadrons of fighter aircraft and bomber wings acted as mobile artillery for the speed freaks, turning the entire operation into a high-speed carnival of destruction that the Evil Sons found enormously entertaining, and that the humans found to be the last thing they ever experienced. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest orc clan, their teeth growing faster than those of any other bloodline, and making them the closest thing orc society has to a merchant class. They are flashy, ostentatious, and deeply in love with showing off their wealth through the acquisition of the biggest, loudest, and shiniest equipment that teeth can buy. For their slaves, the Bad Moon experience is defined by the clan's love of excess and display. Bad Moon camps tend to be better supplied than those of other clans, which means that their slaves may receive slightly more food, if only because there is more food available in the settlement and some of it trickles down. But Bad Moon orcs are also more likely to view their slaves as status symbols, displaying them alongside their other possessions as proof of their owner's wealth and importance. A Bad Moon nob might keep a particularly interesting or unusual human captive as a personal servant or curiosity, but parading them before other orcs in the same way that a wealthy collector might display a rare painting or an exotic animal. This is not kindness. It is a different form of degradation, one that reduces the prisoner from a worker to a trophy, from a person to an object whose only value lies in their novelty. The Death Skulls are the looters and scavengers of the orc world, superstitious creatures who paint themselves blue for luck and steal anything that is not nailed down, and quite a few things that are. Their settlements are built around massive scrap heaps and salvage operations, and their slaves are put to work sorting through the debris of battlefields and wrecked ships and demolished cities, pulling out anything that might be of use to the mech boys and discarding the rest. It is exhausting, dangerous work, and made more unpleasant by the Death Skull's compulsive thievery. A Death Skull orc will steal from anyone, including his own slaves, taking any small comfort or useful item that a prisoner might have managed to squirrel away. Even other orcs consider the Death Skulls to be untrustworthy, which in orc society is really saying something. There is one more type of orc community that deserves special mention when discussing the prisoner experience, and that is the freebooters. These are orcs who operate outside the traditional clan structure, forming independent warbands that roam the galaxy in search of loot, adventure, and good fights. Freebooters are pirates in every sense of the word, preying on shipping lanes and raiding vulnerable worlds with a casual disregard for any authority, orc or otherwise, for their captives, A freebooter captivity has a distinct flavor. The freebooter captain, Uzgul, known as Uzgul the Magnificent, openly admitted to preferring Eldari slaves over humans, reasoning that the Eldari lasted longer under harsh conditions and had more hidden strength to exploit. He kept the precious spirit stones of his Eldari captives as hostage collateral, demonstrating a level of sophisticated cruelty that went beyond the usual Ork approach of simple physical dominance. Now, through all of this darkness, all of this horror and degradation, and slow grinding destruction of everything that makes a human being human, the question inevitably arises. Can you escape? Can a prisoner of the Orks find a way out of captivity and back to Imperial space? Back to something resembling freedom? Back to a life that does not revolve around fungal mash and the crack of a Rundhard's whip? The answer is complicated, and it is not the answer that most people want to hear. On one hand, the very qualities that make Ork slavery so oppressive also create potential opportunities for escape that would not exist in a more organized prison system. The Orks are not methodical jailers. They do not maintain detailed records of their slave populations. They do not conduct roll calls or bed checks or any of the systematic monitoring that a human prison system would employ. Their security infrastructure is virtually non-existent, consisting primarily of Rundhards with whips, squighounds that patrol the perimeter when they can be bothered to do so, and the overwhelming physical presence of the Orks themselves. A clever prisoner who can avoid drawing attention, who can move quietly through the chaos of the Ork camp, who can exploit the gaps in greenskin attention that inevitably occur in a society as disorganized and easily distracted as the Orks, might conceivably find a way to slip away unnoticed. On the other hand, slipping away is only the beginning of the problem, because escaping from the immediate confines of the slave camp is one thing. Escaping from Ork-held territory entirely is something else altogether, something so difficult that it borders on the impossible for all but the most extraordinary individuals. If you are on an Ork-held world, the entire planet is enemy territory. Every direction you run, you are running into more Orks. The wilderness between settlements is patrolled by roving mobs, speed freaks tearing across the landscape in their vehicles, squighound packs that can track a human scent across kilometers of open ground. The vegetation itself may be hostile, the native plant life having been supplemented or replaced by the orkoid fungal ecosystem that springs up wherever the greenskins settle, a biological carpet that can harbor parasites, toxins, and the ever-present spores that will eventually grow into new Orks and Gretchen, perpetuating the infestation even if the current generation is somehow defeated. If you are aboard a Space Hulk or Ork Void vessel, the situation is even more dire. You are surrounded by the vacuum of space, trapped inside a floating metal mountain that is controlled by millions of hostile aliens, with no way to reach safety even if you could somehow get outside. The idea of stealing a shuttle or an escape pod is theoretically possible, but practically suicidal, because Ork spacecraft are designed for Ork hands and Ork minds, and a human trying to operate one is likely to end up as a smear on the inside of a cockpit long before they reach anything resembling friendly territory. And yet, for all these obstacles, escape attempts do occur. The human spirit is a stubborn thing, and even in the most hopeless circumstances, there are always individuals who refuse to accept their situation and who will risk everything, including the near certainty of a horrible death, on the slimmest chance of freedom. Most escape attempts fail. This needs to be stated clearly and without equivocation, because the reality of attempting to escape from Ork captivity is not the heroic adventure that fiction might suggest. Well, most escapees are recaptured within hours, run down by squighounds or spotted by a passing mob of boys who find the sight of a tiny human running desperately across open ground to be one of the funniest things they have seen all week. The punishment for attempted escape varies, but it is never mild. Some Rundhards make an example of recaptured escapees, beating them in front of the other prisoners as a deterrent. Others simply feed the offending slave to the squigs, solving the disciplinary problem and the feeding problem at the same time. A few, the more creatively inclined Runthards devise punishments that are specifically designed to be so memorable that no one in the camp will ever try to escape again. But occasionally, very occasionally, an escape attempt succeeds. And the lore provides scattered accounts of humans who have made it out of Orc captivity and lived to tell the tale. Though these accounts are rare, and the survivors are often in such poor physical and psychological condition that their testimony is fragmentary and unreliable. Some were rescued by Imperial forces, who happened to mount an assault on the Orc settlement in question, liberation coming as a byproduct of military operations rather than a deliberate rescue mission. Others found ways to hide in the margins of Orc territory, surviving on scavenged food and stolen water until they were eventually discovered by Imperial patrols or Allied forces. A few, a very few, managed to steal Orc vehicles or communications equipment and signal for help. Though the technical challenges of operating alien machinery designed for users of a completely different species and cognitive framework make this an almost impossibly difficult feat. The most famous escape from Orc captivity remains Commissar Yarek's rebellion aboard Gazkul's Space Hulk, which we have already discussed in detail. But Yarek's case is the exception that proves the rule. Yarek was not an ordinary prisoner. He was one of the most formidable human warriors in the galaxy, a man whose iron will and tactical genius had already earned him legendary status among both humans and Orcs. His escape was made possible by a unique combination of personal ability, circumstance, and the bizarre relationship between himself and Gazkul, who appeared to view the Commissar less as a prisoner and more as a particularly entertaining plaything. For the average prisoner, for the nameless guardsman, or the captured hive worker, or the enslaved colonist who does not possess Yarek's extraordinary qualities, escape is not a realistic possibility. It is a fantasy, a dream that provides a few moments of psychological comfort before reality reasserts itself and the whip falls again. The rare survivors who do eventually find their way back to Imperial space, whether through escape, rescue, or the vanishingly rare mercy of an Orc who grows bored with a particular slave and decides to let them go, carry scars that go far deeper than the brand on their flesh. Many are unable to function in normal Imperial society for months or years after their return. The constant hypervigilance that was necessary for survival in the slave camp does not simply switch off when the prisoner reaches safety. The jumpiness at loud noises, the inability to sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat, the compulsive hoarding of food, the difficulty trusting anyone, even those who are trying to help. These are symptoms that Imperial Medici officers have documented in countless former prisoners, and they are symptoms that many survivors never fully overcome. Some become mute, unable or unwilling to speak about what they experienced, their memories locked behind a wall of silence that no amount of counseling or chemical intervention can penetrate. Others speak of nothing else, as their accounts tumbling out in a flood of words that seems designed to purge the memories from their minds through sheer volume, though it never quite succeeds, because the memories are not in the words, they are in the body, in the flinch reflex that triggers at the sight of green, in the nausea that rises at the smell of fungi, in the phantom pain of a brand that healed years ago but still burns in the dark hours before dawn. And some, perhaps the most quietly damaged of all, find themselves strangely, shamefully nostalgic for certain aspects of their captivity. Not for the suffering, not for the cruelty, not for the endless grinding labor and the constant proximity to violent death, but for the simplicity of it. In the slave pens, the only question that mattered was whether you would survive another day. There were no politics, and no bureaucracy, no forms to fill out in triplicate, no tithe to pay, no complex social obligations to navigate, no expectation that you would be anything other than what you were, a creature trying to stay alive for one more hour. For some survivors, the overwhelming complexity of Imperial life, with its endless hierarchies and regulations and expectations and demands, feels paradoxically more oppressive than the crude simplicity of Orc servitude. This is not affection for their captors. It is something deeper and sadder than that. It is a fundamental rewiring of the human psyche that occurs when a person is stripped of everything except the most basic survival instincts and forced to live in that state for so long that it becomes the new normal, the baseline against which all subsequent experiences are measured and found wanting. Yet the Imperium itself has a complicated relationship with the concept of Ork captivity and with the survivors who emerge from it. Officially, the party line is clear. Humanity's enemies are to be fought and destroyed, and any human who falls into alien hands is either a martyr to be mourned or a failure to be forgotten. The uplifting primer makes no mention of what a soldier should do if captured by Xenos, because the official position is that capture simply is not an option. You fight until you win, or you die trying. There is no third alternative. There is no contingency plan for survival in captivity, because acknowledging that such survival is possible would be tantamount to admitting that defeat is acceptable, and defeat is never acceptable in the Emperor's service. In practice, of course, capture happens all the time, and the Imperium's response to returned prisoners varies wildly depending on the circumstances, the authority handling the case, and the political considerations of the moment. Some former captives are debriefed by the Ordo Xenos, the branch of the Inquisition responsible for dealing with alien threats, and their experiences are recorded for intelligence purposes before they are returned to service or civilian life. Others are subjected to extensive medical and psychological examination to ensure they have not been contaminated, corrupted, or otherwise compromised by their time among the aliens. The Imperium is, above all else, paranoid, and the idea that a returned prisoner might be carrying alien spores, alien diseases, or alien ideas that could spread to the general population is taken very seriously by those in authority. Bias and others still are simply made to disappear. Their stories are deemed too dangerous, too demoralizing, too disruptive to the official narrative of imperial invincibility to be allowed to spread among the general population. These unfortunates vanish into the bowels of the inquisitorial apparatus, their testimony sealed away in classified archives, their existence erased from the records as thoroughly as if they had died on the battlefield where they were captured. It is a second kind of imprisonment, more bureaucratic than the first, but no less complete, and for some survivors, the betrayal of being silenced by their own people after enduring the horror of alien captivity is the final blow that breaks whatever was left of their faith in the system they once fought to defend. Yeah, because the truth about Ork captivity is not just horrifying on a personal level, it is horrifying on a strategic level. If the citizens of the Imperium fully understood what happened to those captured by the Orks, if they truly grasped the scale and the systematic nature of greenskin slavery, if they knew about the breeding pens and the darkness and the slow erasure of everything human, the impact on military morale could be devastating. Why fight, a soldier might ask, if the worst possible outcome is not death, but something far worse than death? Better, the authorities reason, to maintain the comforting fiction that the battlefield offers only two possibilities, victory or a clean end. Better to let the soldiers believe that the greenskins simply kill everything they encounter, that there is nothing to fear but a quick death. And that capture is not something they need to worry about because it simply does not happen. But the truth exists, regardless of who acknowledges it. It exists in the scars on the bodies of survivors. It exists in the classified reports of the Ordo Xenos. It exists in the nightmares of men and women who have seen the inside of an Ork slave camp and can never, ever unsee it. And it exists here, in this telling, because some stories need to be told even when, especially when, those in power would prefer that they remain hidden. There is one final aspect of Ork captivity that I want to spend some time on before we begin to draw this to a close, and it is the one that I find, personally, the most difficult to discuss. It is the darkness. Not the metaphorical darkness of suffering and despair, though there is plenty of that. I mean the literal, a physical darkness in which the most deeply degraded prisoners of the Orks are kept. In the deepest, most established Ork settlements, where the slave populations have been maintained for generations rather than months. where the infrastructure of captivity has had time to develop into something approaching a system. The human captives are kept in conditions of complete and total absence of light. They see nothing. They hear only the sounds of each other and the occasional intrusion of their keepers bringing food or water to the enclosed, communal pens where they are housed. The rest of the time, they exist in a blackness so absolute that it becomes a physical presence, pressing against their eyes and their skin and their minds like the weight of the earth above a buried coffin. In this darkness, deprived of stimulation and purpose and any connection to the world outside their pen, the captives undergo a transformation that is, in its way, more terrible than anything the Pain Boys could devise. They stop speaking first. Language requires a context, a reason to communicate, a shared framework of meaning between speaker and listener. In the darkness, where nothing happens and nothing changes, and there is nothing to talk about, language becomes superfluous. The captives fall silent, their voices atrophying from disuse until they can no longer form words, even if they wanted to. Then they stop thinking in coherent patterns. Thought, like language, requires stimulation, requires input, requires something to think about. In the total sensory deprivation of the dark pens, the mind turns inward and finds nothing there to sustain it, because the memories of a former life have long since faded into meaninglessness. Finally, they stop being human in any recognizable sense. They become creatures of pure instinct, grunting and shuffling in the dark, responding to food and water with the reflexive urgency of animals, flinching from pain with no understanding of what caused it or how to avoid it. Their teeth are removed so they cannot bite their keepers or each other. Their nails are removed so they cannot scratch. Their hair is removed for reasons of hygiene or management that only the Runthird understands. Everything that might allow them to harm themselves or others is taken away, because the Orks want their livestock healthy and physically intact until the moment they are needed. The body is preserved while the mind and the soul are allowed to wither and die, because the body is the part that the Orks have a use for. The mind and the soul were never of any interest to them in the first place. This is the final destination for some prisoners of the Orks. Not death, which might be considered a mercy, not even the brutal half-life of the work camps or the shrieking terror of the Pain Boys' operating table, but this slow, silent, total erasure of everything that makes a human being human. A descent into a darkness so complete and so enduring that by the time it is over, if it is ever over, there is nothing left to save. The body that eventually emerges from the pen, if it emerges at all, is a shell, a biological machine that walks and breathes and eats and excretes, but contains nothing inside that could be called a person. The individual who entered the darkness is gone, and dissolved by the absence of everything that sustains human consciousness, and what remains is something that the Orks consider perfectly adequate for their purposes. I want to sit with that for a moment, not rush past it, not hurry on to the next point, just sit with the reality of what that means, because this, more than any other aspect of Ork captivity, more than the violence and the hunger and the back-breaking labor and the casual cruelty and the fighting pits and the Pain Boys' table and all the rest of it, this is the thing that keeps me up at night when I research this topic. This quiet, patient, systematic annihilation of the human soul, carried out by creatures who do not even understand that they are doing it, who do not know what a soul is, who cannot conceive of its existence, and who would not care about its destruction even if they could. The Orks are not trying to destroy you. That is what makes it so terrible. They are not enemies in the way that chaos is an enemy, actively seeking your corruption and your damnation. They are not predators in the way that the Tyranids are predators, consuming you as part of a biological imperative to feed and grow. They are not torturers in the way that the Dark Eldar are torturers, inflicting suffering as a conscious and deliberate act of creative malice. The Orks are simply living their lives, pursuing their own interests, following their own nature, and your destruction is a byproduct of that process, incidental and unremarked upon. like dust settling in the wake of a passing vehicle. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. That is what they say. That is the tagline, the mission statement, the fundamental truth of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. But for the prisoners of the Orks, there is something worse than war. There is the aftermath of war, the moment when the fighting stops and the real suffering begins. The long, grinding, soul-destroying experience of existing as property in a civilization that does not recognize you as alive, that cannot comprehend your pain, and that will use you up and throw you away without ever knowing or caring that you were anything more than a particularly fragile tool. Not every Ork prisoner meets the same fate. Some are worked to death in the factories within weeks of their capture. Some are torn apart on the painboy's table within days. Some are consumed as food. Yes, some are thrown into the fighting pits for entertainment and survive for months or even years through a combination of skill, luck, and the desperate animal cunning that extreme suffering breeds in those who are strong enough to endure it. Some are used and discarded so quickly that their captivity is measured in hours rather than months. A brief, brutal interlude between the battlefield and the grave. And a very few, a vanishingly small number, find their way back to the light. They carry with them stories that the Imperium would rather not hear, scars that the Medici cannot fully heal, and memories that no amount of time or therapy or chemical intervention can erase. They are the witnesses to a horror that most humans will never have to face, and their testimony, fragmented and painful and often disbelieved, is the only window we have into a world that exists just beyond the edge of the battlefield, in the places where the propaganda stops and the truth begins. But all of them, every single one, from the moment of capture to whatever end awaits them, shares one fundamental experience. They know what it means to be seen and not recognized. To exist in the presence of another intelligent species and be regarded as nothing more than raw material. To scream and not be heard, not because the sound does not carry, but because the creatures around you simply do not possess the cognitive framework to understand that your scream is anything other than noise. That is what it is like to be a prisoner of the Orks. And in a galaxy that is already drowning in horror, where every species faces threats that would be unimaginable in any other context, where entire worlds are consumed and entire civilizations are extinguished, and the laughter of dark gods echoes through the space between stars, it is one of the few experiences that can make even the darkness of the far future feel a little bit darker, a little bit more complete, a little bit more like the abyss that the Imperial poets write about when they speak of the void between the stars, where no light reaches and no prayer is heard. I want to end tonight on a different note though, because for all the horror that we have discussed, for all the suffering and the degradation and the slow erasure of everything human, there is something else in these stories that deserves to be acknowledged, and that is the resilience, the stubborn, irrational, magnificent resilience of the human spirit in the face of conditions designed to crush it. And Yarrick organized a rebellion on a space hulk filled with millions of Orks. Prisoners in the work camps formed bonds of friendship and loyalty that sustained them through years of captivity. Men and women whispered prayers in the dark, holding on to their faith when every piece of evidence suggested that their faith was misplaced. Soldiers shared their last mouthful of fungal mash with a fellow prisoner too weak to work, knowing that the gesture would make no difference in the long run, but making it anyway because it was the right thing to do, and because doing the right thing was the only form of resistance left to them. These acts of defiance, small and large, spoken and unspoken, are not footnotes to the story of Ork captivity. They are the story. They are the reason that the horror, terrible as it is, does not have the final word. But because for every prisoner who was broken by the darkness, there was another who carried a light inside them that the Orks could not see and could not extinguish. A light that burned on through the worst that the universe could throw at it, not because it was fueled by hope or by the certainty of rescue, but simply because the person who carried it refused to let it go. That is the truth at the heart of all this darkness. The orcs can take your freedom. They can take your name. They can take your health, your dignity, your connection to everything you have ever loved. They can take your teeth and your nails and your hair and your ability to speak and your capacity for coherent thought. They can reduce you to an animal shuffling in the dark, waiting for a meal that may or may not come. But there is something inside the human soul. It's something that even the most thorough program of dehumanization cannot quite reach, that remains stubbornly, defiantly, irrationally alive even when everything around it has been destroyed. Call it the will to survive. Call it the spark of the divine. Call it the emperor's gift, or the accident of evolution, or simply the bloody-mindedness of a species that has endured 10,000 years of unimaginable suffering and is still here, still fighting, still carrying that light through the darkness even when the darkness seems infinite and the light seems impossibly small. Whatever you call it, it is real. And it is the reason that the story of orc captivity, for all its horror, is not ultimately a story about despair. It is a story about endurance, about the capacity of the human spirit to survive conditions that should be unsurvivable, to maintain some flicker of identity and purpose and connection in an environment designed to annihilate all three and to emerge, broken but unbowed, into the light of a galaxy that does not always deserve the sacrifice, but benefits from it nonetheless. Thank you for listening tonight. I know this has been a long one, and I know the subject matter has been darker than most of what we cover on this channel. But I believe these stories matter. I believe that even in a fictional universe, the exploration of suffering and resilience and the human capacity to endure tells us something important about ourselves, about what we value and what we fear and what we are willing to hold on to, even when the cost of holding on seems impossibly high. If this journey through the slave camps and the fighting pits and the dark pens of the greenskin settlements has given you something to think about, if it has deepened your understanding of this vast and terrible universe even a little, then I am glad. This is what we do here on Q on 40,000. We explore the corners that other channels might pass over, and we try to do justice to the stories that live there, even the ones that are hard to tell and harder to hear. If you enjoyed this one, or if enjoyed is even the right word for a topic like this, please do consider hitting that like button. It costs nothing, it takes less than a second, and it helps the channel more than you might think. It tells the algorithm that people care about this kind of deep, thoughtful exploration of the lore. And it helps ensure that we can keep making content like this for as long as there are stories left to tell. And if you are not already subscribed, now is a wonderful time to join us. We are building something special here, a community of people who love this universe and want to understand it more deeply, who are not content with surface-level summaries, and who appreciate the kind of slow, immersive, atmospheric storytelling that brings the grim darkness of the far future to life in a way that feels real and meaningful and true. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Hold on to the people who matter to you. And remember that in a universe where so much is taken from so many, the simple act of caring about another person's story, even a fictional one, is in its own small way an act of defiance against the darkness that presses in on all sides. I will see you in the next one. Good night. And one more thing before I go. I have seen a lot of comments lately asking about future topics, and I want you to know that I hear you. Every suggestion, every question, every request that comes through the comments or the community tab is read and considered, and many of them end up becoming the videos you see on this channel. So keep those suggestions coming. Keep asking the questions that nobody else is asking. Keep pushing me to dig deeper into the lore, to find the stories that are buried under layers of codex entries and supplement books and half-forgotten novels, because those are often the best stories, the ones that have the most to say about this universe and the people, human and otherwise, who inhabit it. This hobby is better because you are part of it. This community is better because you are here. And this channel exists because you chose to spend your time listening to someone talk about the grim darkness of the far future in a way that, I hope, makes you feel something, even if that something is occasionally uncomfortable. Thank you for that. It means more than I can say. Now go get some rest. You have earned it. Good
I
night.
hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.